Okay, thank you all for joining us. My colleague, Klaus Dietze, Dr. Klaus Dietze, has been kind enough to agree to informally share with us the ASF activities that he's been involved in to address the incursion in Germany along the Polish border. Klaus is currently the head of office for the international relations of the Friedrich Loeffler Institute, and he's been with that institute for almost 7 years. Prior to that, he was with FAO for 6 years as an animal health officer. He's a DVM PhD with postdoctoral research on preventive animal health concepts, focusing on organic livestock production systems. And I will thank you, Klaus, for presenting this information. This will be like an informal discussion. At the end, we'll take your questions, and Klaus will have that kind of chat discussion with us. So I'll turn it over to you, Klaus.
Thanks, Sherry, and thanks everybody for joining. Quite a number of people I see. Yeah, I mean, I'm presenting something now, and then, like Sherry said, it's informal also because I didn't really prepare the presentation for this audience. It's a presentation I prepared in Spanish. I will hold it tomorrow for people in Uruguay mainly, and some other people in Latin America, and Sherry translated it. And yes, so I will rush through the slides, and I hope that later on we can discuss a few things, because I don't want to bore you with things that you might not be interested so much in, but maybe you have burning questions. And I tried to give you with this presentation, I mean, the slides are used to give a brief overview of what the situation is like in Germany and what has happened over the last year and a half, from prevention to control, basically. Yeah, let's just start moving with it. So you are probably very well aware of the ASF situation in Europe that we have in particular. I mean, on the map here, you see most of the dots that you see are in the European Union, actually, because those are the ones reporting to the European Animal Health Database, and that's where the data is a lot better compared to what we would expect from Russia. Ukraine has a few dots, you can see it. But for us in Germany in particular, I mean, we all knew, okay, African swine fever is present in Europe, and it is a threat to the pig industry. Germany is a big pig producer in Europe, and the disease has been moving. It came from the east, and it has been moving west constantly. And we had these long jumps into the Czech Republic at one stage, where they managed to eradicate it and we had the big jump to Belgium, so it even crossed all the way from Germany. It didn't stop in Germany, it went all the way through, so to say. And those, as you can see on the map here, it's mostly blue dots, which means wild boar, and the red dots are the domestic pigs. So yeah, the very latest was that when we had the first ASF cases on the western border of Poland, so our eastern border, where it got closer to our territory, where people got really worried, and of course Belgium was the core example of it can hit you anywhere, anytime. Nobody was expecting Belgium to become affected there. At least those jumps are impossible to predict. So yes, there was, you can imagine, lots of activities on the prevention side, and it's definitely, for some people, reached also the stage of an exhaustion where people just couldn't hear it anymore. It's like, oh, now again, African swine fever. Yes, we know it. We heard it, but nevertheless, we think many people still didn't fully understand it. That's something that we have to keep on working all the time. So, I mean, in principle, and I think that's might be the same, I would think, for the US and the veterinary services and the possibilities you have is that to control African swine fever in the domestic pig population is an effort. It costs money, but it's completely doable because we do have a pretty good overview of where our farms are, how many pigs they have, and how the marketing works. But the wild boar population, and that's for us really the headache, and as if I recall well, in the United States, it's definitely some areas, the feral pig population, where basically you don't have that control, you don't have the right means. So that was definitely the headache. That is the headache in most Eastern European countries that are affected, and it's our headache now. So the knowledge about wild boar populations is widespread in different sectors. You know, you have biologists, you have environmentalists, you have some veterinarians. They all have different stakes when it comes to wild boar population management, but the actual day-to-day management is the hunters, and that is a private activity. So we know from the start that we need these people to manage a disease control program in that population. But how do we interact with them? How can we get them to do what we think is necessary? What is the legal basis for all this? It's super complicated, and it's something that luckily quite a few things we have sorted out before ASF hit us. Also for veterinary services, I mean, to think, you know, what are your legal rights to do disease control in the wild, let's say, I mean, in the open environment. I mean, we have had the legal rights as veterinary service to go to a farm, and if there is a certain prerequisite, we could kill their animals. Yes, we could enter the farm. They couldn't stop us. We could call the police if they wouldn't let us in. But how is that in the forest, which might be privately owned? I mean, there wasn't a good legal basis to become active, and those are really crucial things in a country where everybody in society knows very well what their rights are, and if you do something and you might break their rights, and you are not on a good legal basis on doing that, it becomes very tricky. And yeah, last but not least, of course, we also need to make sure this all happens in a way that we don't fight against people, but we bring people on board to work with us. And in general terms, this slide just illustrates wild boar population is growing in Europe and in Germany, definitely. This is just the hunting bag that you see over the year, how it grew. Wild boar actually more becoming a pest, or considered a pest here in Germany, in some areas at least. And it's very difficult to reduce a wild boar population. This is largely because of the changes in agriculture in general. We have, of course, climate change also does its contribution. The winters are milder. We have much less snow coverage in the winter that would reduce naturally the wild boar population. We have lots of corn growing, lots of cereals growing, rapeseed growing. So bottom line, in some areas, when you talk to hunters, they have until, probably April, maybe May in a year to start hunting on wild boar. Then those animals disappear into the agricultural fields where it's impossible to even see them. And they won't come back into the forest until the final harvest of the corn, which is in probably September, October. And in that time, they are happily feeding and growing. So it's a big headache. And then the question is, how much do we know about this population and what's going on in there? And one thing that was designed by the Hunters Association first, and it was then kind of widened a bit, in particular for the African swine fever problem, is that they designed an app where anybody could use it, but it was particularly spread around the hunting community. And their neighboring communities, let's say thematically, that you could report if you see any fallen wildlife along the road or wherever you are, and you could report that. And then, of course, this was of particular interest for wild boar than for African swine fever, so it was pushed towards that it was used more. And we created a direct link to the information system of our veterinary services from that app, that basically if a wild boar was detected and it was georeferenced, automatically the responsible veterinary authority for that area received that information, so they could actually go there and sample the animal, or at least they knew it was there. Not every time we sampled them, but at least we had the chance. Because from what we learned from African swine fever, at the end of the day in wild boar populations, you need to find dead wild boar, and because you have dead wild boar in any case. I mean, without a emerging disease in that population, still naturally animals will die, and you need to find them and test them. And when you have them and you test enough of them negative, you can be sure that you don't have ASF, but otherwise it's difficult to find out if you have it. And then a lot of documents were created for early detection. For example, this is a document together with the Hunters Association, again, to see what are they supposed to expect in the forest or in their hunting grounds, what to see, and what samples should they take? Should they take samples if they just find some bones? And all these key questions were addressed in those kind of documents that are then widely spread in the hunting community. And at the same time, for the veterinary services, an extensive list of measures that can and should be applied if African swine fever would be detected in wild boar, and different scenarios were basically gone through, only focusing on wild boar, not domestic pigs. There it's relatively straightforward. EU legislation is quite clear what to do. But in the wild boar section, there are so many unknowns, or so many parameters that are a one-size-fits-all approach simply doesn't work. So we had to work with scenarios. It depends on the time of the year. It depends on the area, the landscape, the wild boar population, the estimate at least, and how interconnected they might be with the neighboring populations and so on. So it's quite complex, as you can imagine. So yeah. Basically, for the early detection, really the indicators that you need to look at is, like what I already said, is in any population there will be animals dying, and at the early incursion of African swine fever, you will not have a massive die-off that you will see. It takes some time until this becomes really noticeable. So the better you are in finding dead carcasses without African swine fever and testing them, the better you will be in early detection. So you can already ask yourself the question on your feral pig population: how many samples of dead feral pigs do the veterinary services in the US test on a yearly basis? And you can have an estimate of the overall population and see what share you are probably getting. And the better you are in that one, the earlier you will detect African swine fever. Then of course it did hit us eventually, as you know. So we're almost into a year now of being African swine fever positive in a wild boar. And how did we find out? It's an interesting story when you look at most of the European countries affected. We all talk always about the hunters and how important they are because they know the area and all that. But interestingly enough, most of the first notifications did not come from any hunter. There's always other people, and here it was a hiker basically walking the dog, and the dog found something, and it wasn't a freshly died wild boar or something. You see it was bones and with a bit of leftover there, so there was a advanced stage of decomposition already, and that was tested and it was positive. And then you know already that if this carcass has been there for a while, the disease has been there for a while. So yes, the first wild boar you test positive is most likely not the index case on your territory. So you will have to start a good search. And that's the key question. When you find your first carcasses that are tested positive, where on the curve of the epidemic are you? Are you fairly early? And the earlier you are, the better chances you will have to control the disease. That's for sure. But that's something you need to find out. And that's, well, I'm not saying we're still in that process of finding out. Now we know more or less where we are, but it takes time. And this is a nice quote that I use then from the famous boxer Mike Tyson, that everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And that's true because, like I said, we had many plans and many ideas, but of course the devil is always in the detail when it really happens, and then many plans will have to be revised. So the best plans you can have are flexible and are really good in adapting to an evolving situation, because in particular in Germany, I'm not sure exactly how the US organizes its disease control, but we are also a federal state in Germany, so we have our Bundesländer is what you guys' states are, and they are very independent when it comes to disease control in the veterinary sector. And yes, they talk to each other, they try to harmonize as much as they can, but when the crisis is there, that looks different. Then immediately the people fall back into a scheme where they know, okay, I'm responsible for my territory, and of course I do what I think is best now, and if the neighbor thinks something else is good, they can do it, but they shouldn't tell me what to do. To some extent, you can always understand that, because yes, they are responsible, and it's their head that's going to roll if things go really bad. But at the same time, if that leaves us with a very scattered approach, that doesn't help for sure. So at the very beginning, like I said, you need to find out what is your infected area, and that is a nightmare. So we used anything you can imagine that can be used. Dogs were trained earlier already to become sniffer dogs for carcasses. The military helped where they could in terms of personnel, but also because we had military areas affected. Helicopters with infrared cameras, they can also detect carcasses, of course, because they still have a bit of a temperature left because of the insects in there and what else happening, the decomposition process. But of course that also depends on the weather conditions and what time of the year you're in. If the trees are full of leaves and the carcasses are far down on the ground, it becomes difficult. Drones were used with cameras on it to detect in areas that were not very suitable for people to go through. But there was a lot of search by doing on foot, And then you need to identify your zones, your infected zone, at-risk zones, buffer zones. That depends a lot on your legislation, what has to be established. But basically, what you try to do is, you do the same. You apply the same principles like you would do on a farm. Only that now we are not talking about a farm, but about a certain ecological area, a habitat. So to fence it off is a bit more tricky, and it takes a lot of resources. And these fences, it's not like you identify nicely in a relatively quick time where's your infected area, and then you build a nice fence around it, and that's it. Those fences are moving because things keep changing, as you can imagine. And then it's not only about a wild boar and a veterinary service trying to control that population. You have people working on agricultural fields. You have people going into the forest. You have people, either they do it for work or for leisure, but it's not like a farm that you can just block off and that's it. So there's a lot of things that need to be considered. You need to stop certain activities for sure, but you cannot stop things forever. So you need to provide ways out of a crisis there relatively quick, because people not involved in livestock production, not involved in the pork business and whatever, they have little understanding for a long-term interruption of their activities. So, and then of course type of fences is always discussed. How the quick one is usually the electric fencing that you can do, like you would use it for sheep herds or something out on the pastures. But of course, most fences are not wild boar proven. And so if you ask a wild boar ecologist, they will tell you about almost any fence that you show them that they will find ways to overcome this hurdle. And that's true. But nothing is 100%, but you need to start working on it. So this is how it all started. Like I said, you need to identify your zones, and the approach that we're doing now, not only in Germany, but in the European Union, is that you try to establish a zone blanche, a white zone around your infected area. The area in here with the red dots, it's infected anyways. Of course, you need to fence it off and you need to work in it, but this is not your primary concern. Your primary concern is the zone around it where you don't want the disease to spread into and then to jump into wilder fields. So, to hopefully have a zone right around the infected zone where you try to eliminate wild boar as good as possible. That's the approach. But that's how the picture looked at the very beginning. But you see then, other components, other parts were added to it because we had other infected zones. So this was growing and growing, and the white zone, of course, was then also moving. So you need a long. You need to be in good condition. You need a long breath for this. You need a lot of resources for it, and then it's not likely to stop quickly. And again, very important, your surveillance system in the wild boar population. Positive samples are important to know where the disease is, but the negative samples are important to tell you where it's not. So you need to test around this area as good as possible to make sure you find early enough if the disease has already moved. And don't put too much emphasis on hunting for surveillance reasons, because the animals you hunt are usually negative. The positive ones are the carcasses. And well, yeah, it's probably that it's a dynamic situation. It was first one introduction on one side, then a bit further north was the second introduction, and then further south in another federal state, the third introduction. Hotspot, so to say. We don't consider this single introductions. It's more a wave coming at us. And by now, let's see how this moves on. Yeah, you see here, the disease has moved inwards a bit, not too far yet, but it's difficult, and we are working hard on preventing it from moving further in. You can see in the middle, you don't see my cursor, do you? No, I don't. Can I? No, let's not do any experiments here. In the middle, the picture that you see, the darker black line is going around Berlin. So, once the disease would hit Berlin, that has a lot of wild boar, but it's impossible to hunt there, and it's impossible to implement disease control without having a major outcry of the society there. This will be a real nightmare, even worse than the one that we're living through right now. So, yeah, obviously, like I already highlighted, this is a cross-border problem. We are seeing ourselves confronted from a wave of ASF introductions coming in from Poland. So there's a lot of fencing activities along the German-Polish border. Germany has a bit of a history of having a wall or fences in the middle of the country for some time, so people are not too happy about establishing again these kind of separations between countries. But for disease control reasons, now it's something to think about. But again, this is about wild boar, and there are so many other animals crossing that border for good reasons, probably. Ecologists are not happy with us blocking any migratory movements of larger animals through those fences. So it's not clear how well we can maintain certain things for a long time. But for now, this is what we try to do. And there's a room for discussions on that, of course. Here's an example about the fences. Like I said, it's not one nicely made circle and as a fence. You see here, all these lines are fences. They keep being expanded. They keep being made extra. There's still gaps in between because it's we're talking about many miles of fences here, along roads, along highways, along any borders that make it easier to construct a fence. You don't go cross country per se, but you try to stick with already existing visible borders that you can then also easier control. But it's quite an exercise, as you can imagine. And yeah, like I said, then of course what happened, well, not of course, but unfortunately what happened is that we also got the introduction into the domestic swine. Simply because whenever you have African swine fever in the area, in a wild boar population, and it's you are in the peak of an epidemic, the disease burden is the viral load in the environment is high, and it's difficult to prevent that forever from your domestic pigs. How exactly do our farms get infected? Of course, that we don't know, but there's several hypotheses. But at the end of the day, a farm is an enterprise. There's people working there, and even if they understand very well what the biosecurity rules are, that doesn't mean they live at 100% every day. And the higher the viral load in the surrounding is, the higher the chances that every now and then there is a chance for a virus to become introduced, and that's basically what happens. Until now, we had 3 farms affected. 2 of them were actually really small-scale farms with less than 10 animals. So those are farms, really the non-professional farms, where if you ask some people here in Germany, they think we don't even have that anymore.
Klaus, this is Dana. I don't think we can hear you anymore. We can see you talking, but we can't hear you.
Now you can hear me?
Now you're back. Yes, you're back. Thank you.
Yeah. How many buttons do I have to mute myself without even realizing? Okay, sorry about that. Where did I lose you?
You were just talking about the 2 small producers with just 10 pigs, and how the number of those is fairly unknown.
Okay.
People didn't think that there were such small farms anymore.
Yeah, but again, we still have them. It's not comparable to what we have in Eastern Europe or Asia, but they exist. And you can imagine that the smaller these farms are, the less compliant they are with biosecurity, and probably because they are less professional in the business, if it's even considered a business for them, that they also might not be very well informed about what's going on. The larger farm was an organic farm, where also people were worried in advance because of the rules of organic farming, that they need to have an outdoor run at least, if not completely being kept outside. But here I have to say it's unfortunate that it was an organic farm, because now critics of this farming method feel that they have always been correct. But here the farm was actually complying very well with biosecurity. Pigs were already, because they were in a high risk area, they did not have access to outdoor areas, and they were very well fenced off. So basically it was a pig farm like any other pig farm, and yet they were affected, and that's mistakes here are probably more to be seen on the human factor that is present on every farm, right? Nevertheless, like I said, the control in domestic pigs is relatively straightforward. It's super clearly organized to what has to be done, how it's happening, and the first areas. I mean, in the European Union, we have this regionalization concept, where if you follow all the rules, basically only a very small region of Germany is now blocked of the international trade within the European Union, and the rest of Germany is considered African swine fever free. And the first area that was affected is now already in the process of being considered free of ASF in domestic pigs again. So that is very straightforward. All farms registered are tested, controlled, and with a standstill for a certain time, and then tested again. And then we can be sure there is no ASF in the domestic pig farms, and business can go on. So that is fairly quick if there is no transmission between farms, which for now we could exclude, and ASF dynamics luckily are a bit helpful there because it just doesn't spread so quickly. And at the same time, there were activities to reduce these small-scale farms as much as we can, so they get every holding that has up to 10 animals, they were encouraged to send their pigs to slaughter already before the introduction of ASF into domestic pigs, to get an extra premium. So they would not just get the money from the normal marketing, but they would get an extra premium of 200 euros, so over 235 US dollars roughly. So fairly good money. If they oblige themselves to not keep pigs for at least 2 years. And my understanding is that this has been fairly well accepted by a lot of people. They made use of this offer, and we'll see. But as you can see, there are still small-scale farms left, and they did create a bit of a headache. And yeah, this is already the last slide. A lot of information, if you are interested I don't know how familiar you are with the animal health policies in Europe, but it's a very transparent thing. The CVOs or delegates from the CVOs of all the EU member countries meet on a monthly basis and present about the animal. I mean, if there are any reportable or notifiable animal diseases present, they have to give a presentation on the current status. And based on these presentations and the discussions, the member states will or will not confirm the concept of the regionalization of the country. So it's very important to be transparent and to be very clear of what you are doing and what the situation is, because if you miss out to make proper reporting here, sooner or later all Germany, for example, would be blocked off the pork trade in the European Union, which is something that as you can imagine, we will not want to afford. And those presentations are made available online under this link. You can see here from July, there's ASF Germany, so you would get an update of the current status. Luckily for Germany, this was before we had ASF in the domestic pigs, and in August they have a summer break, so there was no presentation in August, because usually when something like that happens, these presentations are questioned quite intensively, and now Germany had more time to actually start the disease control work and get it all done. And when they present now in September, you can look it up. Once the presentations are online, you will see that they can probably already present that some of these issues have been resolved already. But it's quite interesting. You can see it for all the countries that have to report there. Yeah, and most of the pictures that you saw here that come from official sources are actually taken from these presentations from Germany. So this is, it's not a secret what I'm presenting here. This is available publicly. You just need to know where to find it. So that's in a nutshell what I want to present tomorrow to other people, but I hope it was of interest for you as well. But feel free to ask questions on whatever you think you want to know, and I might not be the one to answer all of them, but for sure we can, if I know in what direction you need more information or you want to have more information, we can organize something with other experts that might be more into that subject. That's not a problem. But at the same time, I'm also happy to hear how your state of preparation is, and now in particular in the light of having a potential supplier of African swine fever virus in the a bit closer by now with the Dominican Republic. I'm pretty sure there's some activities also on your end, and some momentum created. So I would also be happy to hear some comments about that from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Klaus. This is Dana. I've turned on my camera so you can we can interact a little bit more. And we do have a lot of questions that have come up in the chat. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go through some of them. Some of them you have already answered as part of your presentation, but there's some interest here in the enhanced biosecurity that producers were taking after the feral swine incursion. And so the question is, what does the increase in biosecurity look like? You mentioned, for example, on the organic farm that they were able to bring their pigs inside. But generally, what's the difference between, routine biosecurity and enhanced biosecurity in the face of a feral swine ASF incursion? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, Germany has, we have learned from the past, so every crisis is a good starting point for making things better. And in particular, our experiences with classical swine fever up until, I think 2006 was the last time we had it in domestic pigs, but in particular in the 90s, that was a big headache. And that made that triggered a lot of changes in legislation. So we have mandatory biosecurity rules for farms depending on their size, according to a legal act, basically, that farms have to follow. And they also are a bit stricter for any farm that is applying any outdoor keeping of pigs. With the specifications, but everything that is outdoor related needs, for example, an approval by the competent veterinary authority, and that approval can be withdrawn when there is an emerging threat. And that is what happened in the affected areas once we had the incursion in the wild boar population. That I'm not sure all, but probably most of the competent authorities, which are the local veterinary offices, withdrew any permits of having outdoor activities with pigs, as an example. So that is a very strict biosecurity tool that could be applied. Again, many of the other things, they are legally binding for pig farmers anyways. And it's just in a moment of crisis where also the controls will be triggered more frequently. So veterinary officers would visit farms more often to check if the people comply. Awareness raising in general, of course, was happening. The interest by the pig farmers was always quite high. It's just a matter of getting the message across properly, that they really understand what we want from them. It's not that they don't want, it's just something they might not completely get it, where the point is. Many of them are also hunters, so it's always a stretch between having a hobby that they invest quite some money in, and at the same time having a profession that might be threatened. What else in terms of biosecurity? I mean, Yeah, the increased controls and there wasn't really a big set of measures that were then introduced, because again, I mean, anything like swill feeding and these issues are forbidden anyways. We had after the BSE crisis, we had very strict regulations on what you can feed to any food producing animal, not containing any animal proteins and all that. So I mean, the sector in that sense was well prepared, I would say. But again, biosecurity for me, the hardware component is much less of the issue. It's the software, it's the people who have to operate that that is difficult. A good friend of mine, he's a veterinarian, a practitioner, and working with swine practitioners, and not too long ago. I mean, okay, by now it's probably a year ago, but still, no, it was before the ASF introduction, but it was already such a high topic, and he went to the farm. The farmer said, well, you know, they did all the controls, and they even talked about African swine fever. And then the farmer said, oh, but I have to show you something before you go. And they go into the feed chamber of the farm, where the feed storage, I mean, and the guy shows him a hunted wild boar hanging there, and he was so proud of this big wild boar that he shot. And then my friend said, well, didn't you tell me you went to this information thingy about African swine fever and all that? And he was fully aware of it, but he just didn't make the connection that it could be him being the one introducing the disease, by not separating his hobby from his profession properly. And so, yeah, I mean, this is just one example really from from the real life, you know. It's people, we have informed people, and they somehow understood, but did they connect all the dots properly? Definitely not. And that's, you cannot exclude that. It's, you have to keep working on it, but yeah.
So do you have any estimates of the success you've had in removing wild pigs from the landscape, and how are you disposing of them?
Well, the how to answer that question? I mean, the disposal is quite, there's quite some logistics behind it now, of course. I mean, when we now talk first about the affected areas where we do all the carcass search massively, because removing the carcasses basically means removing the virus from the system. Eventually, that's how you can most effectively get rid of ASF. And so there's a lot of carcass collection points in all the affected areas. There is at least one, even several, depending also on the hunting grounds, how they are distributed and so on, to avoid people having to move carcasses out of there, who the ones who find them. But and then there's the usual collection scheme by the rendering plants, and they pick them up in safe containers, so that is safe, you know. In terms of biosecurity, it's getting them into these containers first when they are found and tested and so on. How good are we? That's a good question. How confident are we in that? I mean, it's ongoing work, but African swine fever, that's the thing, you know. African swine fever is very good in eliminating the wild boar population by itself. It's so the disease is quite good at that. The question is really, how good are we in the bordering line between the infected area and what we fence off, and then hopefully have a buffer zone and so on. And that's where we want to eliminate the wild boar, not just by carcass search, but of course by hunting, trapping, by doing whatever we can. But it's difficult. I don't think anybody can really claim that they have cleared a larger area from wild boar completely. It's just not happening. These guys are here to survive. But reduced population for sure. Yeah.
So we have a question about the mechanism of introduction. You mentioned that you're not sure how African swine fever got into the few domestic herds you did, and I'm going to tack on my own question to this based on concerns we have here in the U.S. Among our industry, and that is, what are your top, first of all, what are your top theories about how they got infected? And secondly, you mentioned that your wild boars spend a lot of time in agricultural fields a good portion of the year. Are any of your top theories about introduction related to maybe contamination of feed products in agricultural fields being fed to pigs?
Yeah, definitely. That's one of the hypotheses that we have. Of course, it's always tricky when you do outbreak investigations. I wasn't involved in the outbreak investigations here, so I don't know details. I haven't been there on the sites, but I've been in outbreak investigations for other diseases, HPAI and others, where, I mean, normally you don't find the reason for the incursion. That's basically it's sad, but that's the standard that we have to live with. So you have a list of hypotheses that some are more likely than others. But we are getting also into a field very quickly where yeah, maybe what happened wasn't supposed to happen, was even illegal. And of course, people will never tell you that. You can speculate on that, but it's difficult, a difficult field to move in. And maybe veterinary services are not the ones who should spend too much energy on that. On the obvious ones, yes. I mean, if in particular roughage was fed to the animals, and we are talking about an area that has affected wild boar even close by those premises, or relatively close by those premises, where they have to ask themselves the questions if that is a good idea to do. It's not supposed to happen. But sometimes the legal basis might be too vague to really conclude that they did something illegal. But yeah, feedstuffs come from all over the place in the European Union, from other infected areas as well. Those are discussions that are ongoing. How high is really the risk of feeding cereals that might have been contaminated because of a dead wild boar in those fields during the harvest time and all that. I mean, there's a lot of, let's say, more from the academia or from the scientific side. A lot of work is done on that. But what does it mean for real life on a farm, and the real way of incursion of a disease? It's difficult to assess. It's really, really difficult. And again, in theory, it's so easy to prevent African swine fever to enter your farm if you stick with the strict basic biosecurity rules. You can be pretty sure you won't get it. But again, this is a daily thing, and to keep that up on a daily basis on a farm, that's where people are working, and they are working on many areas on that farm. Those are all family-run farms with maybe the one or the other extra worker, sometimes also, of course, cheap labor that is probably not trained so in detail about many aspects of animal production. So it's simply a very difficult thing to manage. Yeah. So and again, for veterinarians, if we find easy ways, or not easy, but if we find obvious ways of disease introduction, of course we can draw our conclusions. But that is not very often the case, and we should probably not waste too much time on that. But as long as we have disease control to be done, because that's the more important stuff for us now.
I think we have. I mean, I'm hoping we can fit one more question in that before we're closed here. Thank you so much for this information. It was really, really interesting, and we really appreciate you taking the time. But one more question we have is, do you have any idea on the mortality rate in the wild boar in Germany from this disease? You mentioned that it was effectively limiting your populations. Do you have an idea of the mortality rate?
The mortality rate of in the population that is affected with African swine fever, yeah, don't let me speculate too much here, but the mortality also from what we see on the Baltic states is extremely high. I'm not saying 100% because in nature nothing is 100%, but we are there are many areas where once the African swine fever wave runs through it, hunters do not hunt wild boar anymore simply because they don't find them. So you are really close to zero, but you are not at zero, and there might also be migration back into the area. So these populations reestablish themselves quite quickly. You know, it doesn't take decades for them to be back. And that's at least what we see in the Baltic states, where in areas that have been very quiet, no outbreaks reported simply because there were hardly any wild boar left. Now they are back on track. At a lower level, of course, it takes some time, but the proliferation rate of these animals in combination with what I said, climate and feed availability and all that is so high that it's really a challenge. And again, the natural mortality rate, there are some hypotheses about that circulating. I'm not the expert on it, but there's some literature out there as well that deals with, how many wild boar should you expect to find if you would find every or a certain percentage of the dead wild boar that occur without African swine fever or another infectious disease present. That's also a very interesting one to look at.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We still have a few questions in the chat box. Perhaps we can, continue some dialogue by email or I'm sure we didn't get to your questions for us either. So, but I think we're out of time, and some people are having to drop off for other calls. So we'll do get in touch with Sherry. We'll do some follow-up, perhaps, and exchange some more questions. We want to thank you again for taking the time. Really, really good talk. I'm sorry we didn't get to a few more questions, a little more dialogue, but we can do that here coming up. Some really good questions still coming in. So thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning, and thank you to our speaker, Klaus, and to our host who set this all up. Thank you for managing our technology.
Yeah, and again, if there are certain specifics, I'm also happy to link you with other experts if you want to go into some details. I'm more the person that can give you an overview, but not so much the details.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Liz too, and we'll get a copy. We'll get a copy of the chat questions, which I can share with Sherry and everyone, so we can address some of those questions at another date.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Sounds good.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Dana? Okay. Klaus, this is Sherry. I just want to thank you, as Dana's been thanking you, for taking time to share your experiences. And I think we have enough interest that perhaps that we'll get we'll organize another time when we all can talk again and convey more of the findings and understanding of how to address this type of incursion, because we're concerned also, of course, and sharing what we're doing as far as preparing with you too.
Yeah, sounds good.
Well,
I'm all up for it to keep a communication channel open, up and running, because we can all benefit from it. Yeah, definitely.
All right. And thank you, Sherry. All right. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.